Hey team, and welcome back to another video in our Astrological Magical Elections video series. So after a little bit of not really having good electional opportunities to talk about, we're back and we actually have something to talk about. That's the good news. The bad news is, of course, that there's only one election opportunity I was able to find to talk about, but I suppose that one is better than none, and beggars can't be choosers, and it's actually not too bad of one to talk about. So why are we in this mess? Why has it been that we haven't really had any magical elections to talk about? Most of it is just about the conditions of the planets right now. Whenever we're electing for a magical election, we have to have certain conditions in place, particularly when it comes to things like the planet that rules the ascendant and the planet that the moon is applying to. We don't want that planet to be retrograde. We don't want that planet to be like afflicted by the square opposition of a malefic. And we don't want that planet to be combust. And that kind of is everybody right now. Saturn retrograde, Jupiter retrograde, Mars stationing retrograde, and then Venus and Mercury are combust. So just kind of a lot bad going on kind of at the same time, which limits kind of what we can do. And that theme more or less continues. Now we're kind of getting into the phase where Saturn is stationing direct, which is good. We'll be able to use Saturn a little bit more. And then Mars is stationing retrograde, so we're kind of trading out Mars for Saturn here. And we're just kind of waiting for a little bit more time for Venus and Mercury to move past the Sun to get more viable there. And then we'll have more to work with after that happens. So, we're almost there. It's not uncommon for eclipse season to cause breaks in the astrological magic that we can do. That's what eclipses do. They're great warnings. They're great stop signs. Take a breath. And that's kind of the thing that we end up dealing with sometimes, which is definitely what's happened now. So because there's only one election to really talk about, we're going to go ahead and get that out of the way, and then we're going to kind of change gears and talk about something else. So stay tuned for that. This is Buttercup. I don't know. Let me see if I can get her focused. Butters, come here. Yeah, this is Buttercup. She's my gray baby. And she's Lee's shadow. She's not super into people. She loves other cats, specifically Lee. And she's going to wander around back there. But you don't really get to see her very much. But all right, taking a look at our kind of one electional opportunity that we're going to have. This is going to be for a 22nd Lunar Mansion talisman. And it's one that everyone will have access to. No matter kind of where you are, Australia, Europe, North America. Everyone should have pretty good, easy access to it. And that is because it takes place at the only time we can really count on a planet. And that is with the moon sextile to the sun. Thankfully the sun isn't really afflicted at this time. The sun can't be retrograde. The sun can't combust itself. So he gets to be kind of exempt from a lot of the problems that the other planets get to experience or things that we might have to dance around for them. So the sun is a really good kind of stable thing to work with and to look for when it comes to crafting electional charts and electional talismans. So our only electional opportunity for this time period is going to be for a 22nd Lunar Mansion talisman. And the 22nd Lunar Mansion is a really great talisman to have. So it's really nice to have this opportunity when we kind of are going through a period where we don't have a lot to really work with or show. The 22nd Lunar Mansion is one that is primarily associated with like freedom and escape. So if you are kind of in any kind of situation where you feel kind of stuck or constrained or like contained or anything like that, the 22nd Lunar Mansion can give you a lot of tools to help kind of break free or, to remove some of those chains around ourselves, whether they're self-imposed or imposed by like systemic issues or anything like that, trying to help us find that exit to get, somewhere better than where we are now. The 22nd Lunar Mansion, ideas of 22nd Lunar Mansion applications: leaving a job you don't like, leaving a household you don't feel comfortable in, leaving a relationship you feel trapped in, like anything like that. Like that's a really great application for it. There's also a medical component to the 22nd Lunar Mansion where we can utilize it for like freedom from pain, escape from illness. So keep that in mind as well if you're going through like a chronic health condition or, it doesn't have to be chronic. It can just be you don't feel very well. Then the 22nd Lunar Mansion can be very helpful for that. So taking a look at our election, this one is set for the North American continent, and it is on October 29th at just after noon. This is at 12:08 p.m. And here we have the moon in the 22nd Lunar Mansion. And she's applying the sextile to the sun. At the same time, we make sure the ruler of the first house, now Saturn here in Aquarius, still slow, still very slow, So that's kind of going to be our trade-off here. The ruler of the first house is really slow. The moon is moving really quickly though, which is a nice kind of exchange. If you're going to have the ruler of the first slow, then you want to have the moon fast, kind of balance it out. The sun is a really good planet to apply to here when it comes to the 22nd lunar mansion. And so I really wanted to make sure to spotlight this election, just because the 22nd lunar mansion is itself very kind of flexible for what it can do, what it can accomplish, and that might be super important and very useful kind of as we're going through this more difficult time period where there's not a whole lot of elections to really choose from. The fields wherein we grow our elections are barren right now. So having a really kind of more flexible talisman like the 22nd lunar mansion can probably solve a lot of problems that problems that we might normally go for or go to more like specialized lunar mansions, we'll say, just aren't available right now. So we end up falling back on the 22nd lunar mansion. The old saying, a jack of all trades, master of none, is oftentimes better than a master of one. Just kind of like a very mercurial thing, right? And the 22nd lunar mansion really proves that in a lot of cases. The Western European version of this 22nd lunar mansion chart is kind of different. I had to kind of force it to work a little bit because I wanted to make sure that if I was going to include an election in this period where there's not a lot to go on, I wanted to make sure that it was something that I could share with everybody. So I did my best to make this one work. The 22nd lunar mansion begins at 0 degrees Capricorn, so we have the moon just barely there. And in the 11th house, normally we would want her on the midheaven or the ascendant, but I wasn't able to do that in a way that worked well. Because if the moon was on the ascendant, she would actually be in the end of Sagittarius, which would be the 21st lunar mansion, which is a big no-no. So I had to put her somewhere where she could actually be into the sign of Capricorn to be in the lunar mansion. And then if I put her on the midheaven, Pisces would be rising, which would bring us to the ruler of the first house as Jupiter retrograde. I'm not very comfortable with retrograde planets serving as the ruler of the first house, so that can't work. So we have to find a nice middle ground by putting the moon in the 11th house and Saturn and Aquarius in the ascendant. Normally, we would avoid a malefic planet like Mars or Saturn in the ascendant, but since Saturn rules the ascendant, it's fine in this case. So there tend to be ways to mitigate rules that are kind of hard and fast no's, or a way to soften them and make them agreeable and useful, and that's one of them. If you have a malefic planet in the first house, it's fine if it rules the first house. So write that down. It'll be on the quiz later. Just like in the North American version of this chart, the moon is applying a sextile to the sun. And I like the sun a lot, of course, in talisman. In lunar mansion talismans, the sun tends to hit a lot of spots that can help with a lot of the more positive lunar mansion's expressions. With the 22nd lunar mansion, it can be really helpful to gain assistance from authority figures, which can make it especially useful if kind of the thing that you're stuck in is being unsatisfied with a career, and getting help from a boss or an authority figure to maybe make your career better for you in some way, or to kind of help you move on to get a jump somewhere else, or kind of any other situation where going to an authority figure for a favorable ruling could be helpful. The sun is all about that. Also just kind of generally about exerting one's independence and individuality and strength in that way, which can be kind of its own thing when it comes to people who feel trapped in situations. Kind of that exertion, that realization that, I am kind of stuck here actually, and that's not okay, and helping them kind of get those first steps to move on can be really useful. The ruler of the first house in this chart, like we talked about before, is of course the Saturn in Aquarius. Saturn is doing very well in Aquarius. We do have that slowness because Saturn has only just recently stationed direct, and kind of takes a little bit, especially for Saturn, to get kind of moving back up in speed. The moon can help with that though, because the moon is actually moving very quickly in this side of the zodiac, which helps to balance some of that out. So all in all, a bright spot of elections when we have not had any for a long time. And then finally, our Australian version for this chart takes place on October 30th at around 9:48 a.m., which is what this chart is set for. And it actually looks more similar to the North American chart, which is unusual for Australian charts. I feel like they tend to mimic kind of their own. They kind of tend to do their own thing. But here we have the moon in the 22nd lunar mansion on the ascendant. I was able to get that in this one, keep it kind of more standard, more normal. And we're still closely applying that sextile to the sun. I was worried when I was initially drawing this up that we would not get the sextile to the sun, and it would be the sextile to the combusted Venus instead. But thankfully we were able to get a great configuration. We were able to keep that configuration with the moon sun sextile with the moon on the ascendant. Again, we're looking to Saturn as a ruler of the first house. Saturn in Aquarius is doing fine, not afflicted, aside from the station or kind of that hanging on to that slowness, which can be an issue. But the moon moving quickly helps to alleviate a lot of that. The moon tends to be who we look for when it comes to to speeding things along or showing how things develop and kind of the speed or the overall kind of manifestation or feel of that momentum behind it, we tend to look to the moon there. So having the moon fast helps to alleviate a lot of that slowness. So unfortunately, that's the only electional opportunity that I really have to share with you guys. That was really all I was able to kind of fish out from this 2-week period that would be useful and effective. So that's kind of all, that's all we got. It's just kind of a really rough kind of period lately where the planets haven't really been on our side when it comes to being good significators for things. And then we just kind of have to deal with that in our practice. And it can be good to have these periods where we're encouraged to rest and, be still and stuff, even though we kind of constantly feel like we need to be doing things. Kind of having that maintenance, that ability to focus and cultivate the talismans that we already have to get us through a lot of these more difficult, more sparse times is kind of, in my opinion, more of the point of astrological magic. It's good to be kind of aware of what's coming and to be able to prepare for it before it gets here. It's kind of how I tend to look at it or work with it or strategize with people. But since that's all we have to talk about I wanted to talk about something else to kind of fill up more time and, make this video a little bit more, useful or informational rather than just like, here's this one election. I hope it's something you can do. I hope you're around when it can be made, or otherwise this really isn't helpful. And that is, I wanted to talk with you guys a little bit about synodic cycles, specifically more about the cazimi. So a synodic cycle is basically any planet's cycle with the sun. So anytime a planet goes from one conjunction with the sun to the next conjunction of the sun, that is that planet's synodic cycle. We see this more obviously, illustrated much more clearly with the moon, who will, of course, conjoin the sun on the new moon or the dark moon, separate from the sun, wax, gain in light until she's full, start to wane, reduce in light, and then come back to the next new moon, where you'll see one of my videos. So hopefully you spend your new moons here, or at least part of them. The moon isn't the only planet that does this. Every planet has a synodic cycle, but the moon is the one that's most obvious because she's the largest, and we can really tap into that lunar cycle, that lunar phase of the waxing and the waning. The other planets have this too, and even stars have this to an extent, though theirs is slightly different. So a synodic cycle begins and ends with the conjunction of the sun. This conjunction kind of serves as the bookends to the beginning and to different cycles, different chapters of a planet's cycle. The basic idea is that a planet is energized by the sun. The planet goes on and, moves throughout the zodiac. And then as it's moving throughout the zodiac, it becomes exhausted and the sun comes back around and reinvigorates it. And the planet moves forward again with kind of like a renewed vigor or like a renewed strength to it. This comes from kind of two different observances. The first is, like we can see with the moon, planets as they separate from the sun get brighter, and then planets as they come back towards the sun get dimmer. That's something that is, like I said, most obviously visible with the moon, but even other planets, that happens with them too. Planets are brightest when they're at their opposition with the sun. The second thing is that as a planet draws closer to the conjunction of the sun, the planet speeds up. So there are 2 points in a planet cycle where a planet is the quickest, and that is at the opposition, and again at the conjunction. And planets tend to be slowest, like Jupiter and Saturn and Mars, tend to be slowest around the trine. Mars is a little bit more like the in conjunction, while Mercury and Venus tend to be slowest at their furthest distances from the sun, where they're kind of slowing down to come back to it. We see this mentioned every now and again in the astrological tradition, where a planet will be characterized somewhat by what stage of its cycle that it's on. A planet that is further along in its cycle is usually talked about as more elderly than a planet that is newer in its cycle, where it will be described using more younger terms. So it can be a way to identify individuals. If somebody is signified by a planet that's kind of more freshly separated from the sun, it might be that chart, whatever it is, that horary or whatever, is talking about a younger person, whereas a planet that's signifying somebody with that planet further along in its cycle might be representing an older individual. So as you're probably gaining from this, there is a consistent life cycle analogy when it comes to synodic cycles. While planets cannot die or pass away, the synodic cycle is essentially the closest that they come to anything that even closely resembles a human life cycle. So planets kind of have this idea of being born at the separation of the sun. They grow up in age until they come to the opposition, where they're kind of at their middle aged, and then they kind of come back around and conjoin the sun, which is their death. And we see this a lot talked about in, especially like medical astrology, where planets that are combust, which are too close to the sun, around like 7-ish degrees, are kind of they have like a signification of death. to them. Like they're old, they're exhausted, they're passing away before they start this new cycle. So there are a couple of like highlights or important positions within a planet's synodic cycle that are worth mentioning. The first is the planet's separation from the sun, which can be a heliacal rise or a heliacal set, depending on the planet exactly. And that is the planet's first emergence from the sun. There is the first station where a planet stops to turn retrograde. There's the opposition with the sun, which happens when the planet is retrograde. Then there is the second station where a planet stops to turn direct. And then there is the entrance into combustion, where a planet kind of passes away into the underworld, where it gets too close to the sun to be able to see. Usually that's about 7.5 degrees. And then there is the cazimi, which occurs when a planet comes to essentially the exact conjunction of the sun. And this is the start and end point of each synodic cycle, the cazimi. And this is what I really wanted to kind of hone in on while talking about this. So everything that I've talked about so far has basically just been kind of the ramp up, like the stage that I needed to set before I could talk about what I wanted to talk about, and that is the cazimi. So there are different definitions for what the cazimi is astrologically. Older texts like the Hellenistic tradition tends to talk about a cazimi planet as being either within 1 degree of the sun or the same degree as the sun. And those sound similar, but they are two very different things. And it really, you kind of have to focus on what we're talking about. So a planet that's in the same degree as the sun would be like both the sun and the planet are at 6 degrees Scorpio. That is being within the same degree of the sun. A planet that is within 1 degree of the sun could be the sun is at 6 degrees of Scorpio and 25 minutes, and the other planet is at 5 degrees of Scorpio and 59 minutes. You know, they're within a degree of orb, but they're in different degrees of the zodiac, and that's a different thing. Personally, I tend to enjoy the medieval definition of cazimi, which is when a planet needs to be within 16 minutes of the sun, and that is because the sun's disk takes up 32 minutes in the sky, so a little bit over half a degree, and 16 minutes is obviously 1/2 of 32, so you have 16 before and 16 after, and I just think that's a really neat kind of astronomical thing. So choose whichever one you like. I think 16 minutes is the most compelling. But cazimis have been kind of like a weird thing for contemporary astrologers to talk about because they seem a little bit paradoxical. When a planet is within 7.5 degrees of the sun, it is considered oppressed, damaged, dying, weakened. But then when a planet gets within 17 minutes of the sun, it's wondrously strong, is how some astrologers describe it. It is empowered in some key way. And astrologers have had difficulty kind of coming to terms with how to reconcile these two things. Astrologers in history will often provide like analogies to planetary conditions. So they'll say, you know, a retrograde planet is like a man walking backwards. A planet stationing direct is like a person who is moving forward with renewed hopes. So there's this very like obvious person momentum kind of focus or like analogy, and they tend to apply this equally with all different kinds of conditions. So there'll be this kind of thing. A cazimi planet is usually described as being like on the lap of the king on his throne, or being with, like sharing the seat with the king is kind of how it's described. On the one hand, I've always kind of seen this image as kind of awkward, like, oh cool, I'm on Santa's lap, here we go. It seems to be more of like this idea of like shared authority, like protected authority. I'm in this authority kind of sphere, in this bubble, like I'm kind of attached to this or getting an idea of it. And getting some benefit from it. So while the image itself is odd, the general idea is that cazimi planets are very strong, and we're able to use them, or they're able to work in kind of weird, mysterious ways that maybe they wouldn't necessarily be able to without being cazimi, right? But if we're talking about cazimis and like what they represent, and so far as like the life cycle analogy of a planet, like what is this? You know, if it's dead, if it dies at the combustion and then it's kind of reborn as it separates from combustion, what is the cazimi exactly? Like what is that in a life stage? Some individuals have recommended thinking about the cazimi as like a conception point, and I think that's a valid way to look at it. It's not necessarily my favorite, but I get it. My experience, or my kind of idea of cazimi planets, is that they represent the moment when the soul of a deceased individual rejoins basically the divine, kind of like that reintroduction, like entering into whatever kind of an afterlife scenario one believes in or one thinks about, just kind of like that moment where a soul reconnects to the divine source, whatever that looks like to you. And that's a concept you can kind of play with depending on your own like religious or philosophical views. I'm not here to like put a particular religious bias on it or proselytize to you one way or another. But I've always just thought about the cazimi as that moment when an individual soul that is passed on reunifies with the wholeness of the vastness of the universe, I guess, before it splinters off and becomes individualized again. And just sort of like that power, that untapped power, that untapped like experience of all that has ever been, that you could I guess connect with. Like I say that like I've been there, like it's not some kind of weird thought experiment that I'm thinking about, but that tends to be how I think about cazimis. But because cazimis represent this cleansing of a planet where its past cycle is over now, and we're about to start this new cycle. People get very interested in utilizing cazimis for magical purposes. And this is kind of where we come back. This is where we're all coming back to. All this has led up to this conversation now. How do you use cazimis in an astrological magical practice? Great question. I think that it's first important to stop and think about how we normally think about utilizing astrological magic. I think that when a lot of people think about astrological magic, they are thinking exclusively about the creation of astrological talismans, which is fair because it is definitely the part of astrological magic that gets talked about or advertised the most. So I totally understand. Even here, that's like 95% of what I do is talk about how to make astrological talismans, or like when to make them, I guess, would be the better way to phrase it. So the immediate kind of knee-jerk response for people is, oh, if I am, how do I use a cazimi in a magical practice? Obviously, I need to make a talisman for it. I don't really like that idea. That's not really something I've ever been comfortable with, partly because I already have kind of really high standards for talisman, like for electional talismans, or for talismanic elections, and trying to make a cazimi work with that just seems like the worst idea ever. Because while I'm sure that every now and again you'll have an instance where there is a cazimi that you can utilize, because it's like it happens while it's angular for your location, and maybe the moon can apply to it, and that's cool. Like just the odds of that happening are super, super slim. And I just don't like it. But so that's kind of like one of the practical sides of it. I don't want to have to elect for it, first of all. And then the second part is I'm a little concerned about what that does. Like what would be the point of a cazimi talisman? Because I would push back on the idea that a cazimi talisman would just be like a purified or a, like a clear, like a blank slate of a planetary talisman that you would use like a planetary talisman. I don't think that's it. There is a deeper kind of significance to this cazimi. And like my biggest fear is that it would just be like a constant like F5 key for like things in somebody's life. So it would be like constantly trying to refresh things, trying to get things to start over and clear themselves out, because that's really all the cazimi knows how to do, right? So it would just be like an interesting kind of thing to say. I've never tested that out, but I just struggle to think of like what else a cazimi plant, like a cazimi talisman would be utilized for. It just seems like a very specific application, a very specific configuration to immortalize in a talisman. So it must do something kind of specific. So I don't think that they can be kind of utilized in a way that would be similar to general planetary talismans. That doesn't seem to be right. So if we're not going to make talismans for it, well, what can we do? Like, well, what else is there? And this is where I would like to remind people, or like to ask people to kind of open up their minds when it comes to astrological magic and like what that means, like as a practice, like as a really spiritual or religious, structured practice. So while talismans are the things that make the money and are the things that get put on the signs and the advertisements and the billboards, and I guess nobody does that, but they're the things that people talk about or know about the most. There are alternative ways to work with planetary magic, and that is through one of them, the one that I like the most, is actually through like timed rituals. So we're not actually making a talisman here, but we're performing some ritual that is timed to this astrological event that is thematically significant or appropriate to it to make it that way. So when it comes to cazimis, what I usually recommend for people, which is a very simple thing, is use it to clean. Use it to clean something. Use it to clean and refresh things. If you have specific planetary altars, wash the altar cloth, make new candles for it, dust and polish that deity statue for it when that planet is cazimi. Like make that your practice, make that your religious practice, make that your cazimi ritual. Just say, okay, Venus is cazimi. I need to throw the altar cloth in the wash. I need to refresh these candles, dust and polish. Get new flowers, get it, like, wash the face, just do the thing, like, make it all nice and pretty again. Venus is being refreshed in the heavens, so your Venus paraphernalia on Earth should also go through some measure of refreshment and cleaning. If you have Venus talismans, it's a really good time to clean those too, especially if it's something that, like a talisman that you've only worked with passively. It can be a really great way to kind of like get back in touch with it and see what it needs to do in preparation for the next cycle, right? One thing that I really like to do specifically for the Venus cazimi is I have a copper alembic, and I like to clean it really well. Like, the flour, the vinegar, the make like a paste, that whole thing. I like to clean it really well. Because as I use it, of course, it gets coppery, green and kind of grungy. And so being able to clean it while Venus is being cleansed herself is a really fun practice to do. During Mercury cazimis, I like to clean my keyboard. So just pop all the keys off of it and air dust it really nice. That's a fun thing to do. So just different ideas like that. Like, what is something physical that I can refresh in the spirit of the cazimi? Another really great option is to do like a intentional reset of that planet's area of significance. One thing I should point out that should probably have been mentioned way earlier in this conversation is that Mercury and Venus are, of course, unique because they will conjoin the Sun twice, once while they are direct and a second time while they are retrograde. And the conjunction that counts, which counts as the reset point at the beginning of the cycle, is when they conjoin the Sun when they are direct. I don't care what Abu Mashar says. He is wrong for a host of reasons that are too long to get into in this video, but I promise you that he is wrong. I say that to say that there is like a legitimate argument to be made from the tradition of astrology to begin the synodic cycles of Mercury and Venus at the retrograde conjunction, the inferior conjunction, which are presented in the works of Abu Mashar, but he's wrong. And that's into discussion. So another thing that I like to recommend for individuals is a kind of ritual reset or cleansing for that planet's area of life that it represents in your birth chart. You can also use this for like general or universal significations, but like a really great example is somebody who's gotten out of a long relationship and they're looking to get back into dating. A ritual during the Venus cazimi to help kind of shake off the baggage from their past relationship so they can start another one fresh without carrying around, whatever the bad thing is that caused the breakup from the previous relationship, can be very helpful in getting people kind of started again on the right track. Maybe use the cazimi 10th house of your 10th house lord to start over in a different job, or to help create a new path in a different job. Just kind of like I'm cleansing, I'm getting rid of all of this stuff that I've accumulated that's holding me back from this past cycle, because I'm ready to begin a new cycle in whatever that is. And I was really excited to be able to have kind of this opportunity to talk about the cazimis and the synodic cycles of planets a little bit now, because we're about to enter kind of a unique period where Mercury and Venus are going to experience their cazimis pretty quickly back to back. Venus is on October 22nd, and then Mercury's is on November 8th. So kind of two back to back that you can utilize if you wanted to. But also just because my own personal practice is evolving a little bit more to incorporate the synodic cycles of planets and stars a bit more. One thing that I recommend doing, and I talk about a lot in like the Patreon and its various communication channels, is of course the utilization of fixed star heliacal rise talismans. I have a page on my website that documents out or tables out a lot of those rise dates if you're interested in that, as well as a video that talks about a program you can use, download yourself, to be able to determine your own heliacal rises. So fixed star heliacal rises are a fun way to utilize fixed star talismans, and you can count on those once a year. Cazimis are another thing you can count on once a year. I wouldn't really use those for talismans, kind of like I talked about. They have their own specific usages, but you could make an argument for making a talisman for the heliacal rise of a planet, which would be kind of neat. You could get that information again from that program. There's kind of like this standard rule of thumb in astrology that a planet that is 15 degrees away from the sun will have its heliacal rise, and that's not necessarily true. That's just kind of like a mathematical standard. It can be earlier, it can be later, depends on the planet, depends on the conditions. So just kind of keep that in mind. But that's all that I really wanted to talk about at this time. I hope that this information has maybe sparked your interest in exploring planetary cazimis and their application in a magical context in kind of different ways. So if you were like, oh, this cazimi's coming up, what can I do with it? Clean your house. That's what you can do with it. Just clean your house. Just use it to like take out the garbage in some area of life, refresh, clean your talismans, reconnect with them, and get ready for that next cycle with that planet. One thing that I would actually be really interested in hearing from anybody this would apply to is if you have made or you've acquired a cazimi talisman for some planet, how has that been? Like, what have the effects been? How do you feel like it's different from kind of like a more standard planetary talismanic collection kind of a thing? I would love to hear some like personal experiences and stories with that. It isn't something that I have a lot of experience in, kind of like for reasons I talked about earlier. But I would love to hear some stories or some kind of first-hand accounts. So if you're somebody who has a cazimi planetary talisman, call me. Let's chat. But that's it for me and Buttercup for this video. Hopefully, as we move beyond eclipse season, things will start to open up again to where we'll have more astrological talismanic collections to talk about. And if not, I guess I'll find some other topic to chat your guys' ear off. So until then, everybody take care, and I will see you guys on the Taurus lunar eclipse.